A woman was found dead in her own home. Police started investigating and immediately found several concerning leads. The longer they looked into the case, the more strange and terrifying details surfaced. After several years, they finally uncovered the truth, but nobody expected such a turn of events. Karen Gregory was born on March 29, 1948 in Albany, New York. She was the eldest of 4 children and helped her parents take care of her siblings from a young age. The girl was into sports and spent a lot of time in nature. Additionally, she loved art and wanted to work in that field. After finishing high school, Karen enrolled in Nazareth College in Rochester, where she received a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science degrees. After that, she worked as an art teacher in an elementary school for several years and then decided to become a graphic designer. In 1983, when she was 35 years old, she moved to Florida where she met a man named David McKee. He worked as a manager in an organization that provided consulting services to Vietnam veterans, and he and Karen quickly became mutually attracted. The couple dated for just over a year, and in the spring of 1984, David asked her to move in with him in Gulfport. Before this, Karen lived in an apartment with her friend, and she constantly had to drive to David's house. The woman accepted this offer and began gradually moving her things there. On May 22nd, Karen took the remaining items from her apartment and finally moved out completely. She told her neighbor that she was a little nervous. David had gone to another state for work to speak at a conference, and she would have to spend a whole week alone in his house. From the apartment, the woman went to her friend's house. They had a great time there. Karen told her friend that she was very happy with David and was glad she would finally be living with him. The friends talked until about midnight, after which Karen went to David's house. The next day, he called home several times, but no one answered. He thought Karen might have stayed in her old apartment and called her neighbor, but the woman said she hadn't seen her since yesterday. After that, David called several of Karen's friends and her sister, but none of them had seen her. He continued to try to reach her all day, but he never got an answer. On the next day, May 24th, David called home again early in the morning, hoping to catch Karen before she left for work, but there was still no answer. Later, he called her boss and found out that she had not shown up for work. At this point, David's concern reached its peak and he feared that something bad may have happened to Karen. He then called local hospitals and police stations to inquire if they had seen anyone matching Karen's description. Upon learning that they had not, he decided to call his neighbor, Amy. David asked her, "Is Karen's car parked in front of the house?" Amy looked out the window and replied, "Yes." This only added to David's worry. He asked Amy to go to the house and knock on the door. He was so anxious that he stayed on the line with her until she left to fulfill his request. Amy approached the side door and knocked, but there was no answer. She then walked around the house and saw that one of the windows was open. She called out Karen's name several times, but there was no response. She extended her arm through the open window, pulled back the curtain, and was shocked by what she saw. The window was in the bedroom, and through it she could see the hallway where a bloodied female body lay on the floor. Amy couldn't see the face because she was behind a wall. She knew it was likely Karen. After recovering from the shock, Amy ran back to her own house where David was still on the phone. She grabbed the phone and told him that something terrible had happened before hanging up and calling 911. Doctors quickly arrived at the scene but were only able to confirm Karen's death. Detectives began investigating the crime scene, which horrified even experienced police officers. Based on the amount of blood throughout the house, Karen had fought her attacker until the end. Bloodstains led from the hallway to the front door, where several fragments of glass had been smashed. Detectives noticed several strands of hair matching Karen's hair color stuck in the broken glass. They theorized that she had almost made it outside but was caught by her attacker. In the bathroom, investigators found their first lead: a bloody footprint on the floor. Police checked Karen's feet and found no bloodstains, so the footprint must have belonged to her killer. However, it was unclear why the killer was walking around barefoot in the bathroom. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that she had received about 20 stab wounds and had been subjected to violence. Before we continue, I have a small request for you. We've created a new channel where we upload content related to old, historical ruins and interesting events. So, if you're interested, kindly subscribe to my channel, Decoverize, for daily interesting videos and show some love in the comments. I'll read every one of your comments. The link is in the description. Experts also extracted biological material from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not used in 1984, so this clue could not help to identify the killer. In addition, several bloody fingerprints were found on her body, but they were too smeared to be used. According to experts, the woman was killed about 30 hours before she was discovered. This meant that she was attacked on the same night when she returned home from her friend's place. There was another detail that immediately caught the attention of the police and doctors as soon as they saw Karen's body. She was wearing a shirt and a lace corset was on top of it. Apparently, the perpetrator did this. When the police finished examining the crime scene and collected all possible clues, they allowed Karen's friends to start cleaning up. The women did not want David to see all this horror. When he arrived, all the victim's acquaintances knew how much he loved her and wanted to ease his suffering at least a little. David's conference was taking place on the other side of the country, so he needed a lot of time to return home. Meanwhile, the detectives began questioning the neighbors. This area was considered quite prestigious and safe, and the crime rate was extremely low. Many residents knew each other, and they even had a neighborhood watch. This is a form of agreement between neighbors when they keep an eye on order and report any suspicious things to the police. However, in this case, the neighborhood watch did not perform its functions. Detectives found out that on May 23rd, at around 1:15 a.m., 16 residents of the area heard a piercing female scream, and none of them called the police. They all said the scream quickly stopped and they did not get the impression that someone could be in danger. Even the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite the victim, did not consider it necessary to call the police. He was fixing his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio when he heard a muffled scream. The man walked down the street and did not notice anything suspicious, after which he returned back. A neighbor who lived opposite David shared an interesting observation. On the morning of May 23rd, she saw that the front door of his house was open, and she also heard a scream that night but did not associate it with the open door. In her story, there was one detail: when the police called, the door was locked. Considering that the body had been in the house for about 30 hours, the culprit could have returned and tried to cover his tracks, including closing the door. It was noteworthy that there were no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Detectives speculated that the perpetrator may have climbed in through the back window, but there were also no signs of forced entry there. Either Karen left it open all night, or she knew the killer and let him in herself. The head of the neighborhood watch shared another interesting observation with the detectives. On the evening of the day after Karen's murder, an unknown man pulled up to her house. He got out of the car, knocked on the door a few times, and kept looking around. Then he returned to the car, but a few minutes later, he came back with a piece of paper in his hand. He placed it on Karen's car windshield and only then drove away. The police immediately checked the car and indeed found a note on the windshield that said, "Karen and David, hi, I stopped by around 7:15 p.m. but didn't see any signs of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back, but I have what you asked for." The detectives immediately noticed the wording, "no signs of life." Given that at the time this person arrived, Karen had been dead for almost a whole day. Such a choice of words was very alarming. The note ended with the name Peter, and investigators tried to find him. It turned out that he had been right under their noses the whole time. The man learned about it from Karen's former neighbor and came to their house. The man cooperated actively and answered all the questions. He voluntarily provided his fingerprints and footprints and also told them what he was doing near the victim's house. According to Peter, a few days before this, Karen called him and invited him and David to dinner. But there was one detail: that David would also be there, even though at the time he was already scheduled to go on a week-long business trip. The detectives also asked Peter what he meant in the note by the phrase, "I have what you asked for." The man said he borrowed a cassette from them and was planning to return it. Another strange detail was that Peter allegedly did not notice the glass shards almost all over the path to the front door, let alone the several broken windows. The man insisted that he hadn't seen anything or paid attention to it. During the conversation with him, one of the detectives noticed a large cut on Peter's hand. When the police officer looked at his hand, the man covered the spot and said that he always gets scratches after playing with dogs or repairing his car. All of the above looked extremely suspicious, and the detectives decided to check his alibi. Peter said that on the night of the murder, he was sleeping at home, and his neighbor confirmed this. The police didn't rush to exclude him from the list of suspects since such an alibi could easily be a lie. However, the investigators quickly came up with another suspect: David, Karen's boyfriend. According to his words, that night he was in Rhode Island, which is located 2,000 kilometers away from his home, and he was sleeping in his hotel room. But at the crime scene, the police found a very interesting clue. A local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23rd, the same day Karen was killed. It was very strange, and the detectives began to wonder if David could have flown to Florida, killed his girlfriend, and returned before his next conference appearance. They calculated the flight and travel times from airports and concluded that it was indeed possible. Additionally, no one could confirm David's alibi for that night since he allegedly slept alone in his hotel room. The head of the neighborhood watch also shared his observations. He had repeatedly noticed that Karen and David argued when the woman came to his house. David, on the other hand, insisted that they had a wonderful relationship and the couple hardly ever fought. When David was asked about the newspaper, he said he bought it on May 21st at a store near his home. He was going to take it with him on the trip to have the weather forecast for the week. They sold that newspaper. He even remembered that David bought it on the 21st. According to the clerk, the publication actually released that issue several days ago, which is normal for printed newspapers. Thus, suspicions against David faded into the background. They asked him if anything was missing from her house, and the man noticed the absence of a white lace corset that Karen had bought for herself a few months earlier, one very similar to the one worn by Karen's killer. This immediately led the detectives to think that the depraved criminal had taken it as a trophy. The police decided to pursue another lead found in the victim's house. A high-quality drawing of a watch signed with the name Stephen Fischler. One particular detail caught the detectives' attention. The paper appeared to be covered in blood. The detectives quickly discovered that Stephen worked with Karen in the same company and questioned her colleagues. They uncovered a lot of interesting information. Almost all the employees said that Stephen was a rather strange person. He persistently tried to court all the female colleagues, shared pictures with them depicting perverted things, and even tried to get a little bit of a sense of humor. And even wrote a perverted poem and tried to persuade his colleagues to read it. All the women who worked with him admitted that Stephen scared them. Karen also complained several times about his behavior, but management didn't give it much thought. The detectives talked to him, and the man denied giving Karen that drawing. He also claimed that he barely knew the victim and offered to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. The investigators quickly organized such a test, and that's where the most interesting part began. At first, everything was calm, but after one of the questions, Stephen suddenly said that he killed Karen. Literally a few seconds later, he took his words back and said that he had nothing to do with it. What was strange was that in both cases, the polygraph operator did not detect a lie. This confused the detectives, but they couldn't rely on the polygraph results. This instrument is far from perfect and simply cannot accurately determine whether a person is lying or not. At the same time, they understood that Stephen was clearly a very strange person and could say anything. Soon, experts studied his drawing and concluded that the red stain on it was left by ketchup, not blood. As a result, that began to doubt whether Stephen was involved in Karen's murder. Despite such a number of suspects, the police still couldn't gather enough evidence against anyone, and the case remained unsolved for several months. Detectives continued to investigate, but they couldn't find any new leads. This continued until December, when something interesting happened. One of the respected residents of Gulfport was retiring, and in honor of this event, local residents organized special events. Many people attended, including a woman named Mary who struck up a conversation with a police officer who was also present. During their conversation, they discussed the murder of Karen Gregory, and Mary inadvertently mentioned that she too had heard her piercing scream that night. The officer immediately noted one strange detail. Mary lived 2 blocks away from Karen's house, and initially the police didn't even interview residents of such distant houses. The fact that the woman heard the scream indicated that it was really very loud. However, the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite Karen's house, described it as muffled. But if the neighbors 2 blocks away heard it, the man clearly could not consider it quiet, especially since at that moment he was in his garage with the door open. All this raised doubts, but the police were not quick to suspect the head of the neighborhood watch. He was 22-year-old George Lewis. He worked as a firefighter and was a good friend of almost all the employees of the local police station. He lived with his wife and young child, and all the neighbors spoke of him as a reliable and decent person. Nevertheless, detectives could not ignore Mary's story. They called George and asked him to come to the station when he had time. The man agreed, but never showed up. It is worth noting that before this, he regularly stopped by the station just to chat with his friends. The chief detective in this case was even at his wedding, so it was difficult for him to imagine George as a killer. In January 1985, they managed to talk to him. George insisted that the scream did not seem very loud to him. Perhaps this was due to the music playing from the radio. The detective asked him if he remembered anything else from that night, but George told him the same thing, except for one moment. When his testimony was taken for the first time, he said that he heard the scream, went out of the garage, and walked down the street. But this time he stated he just walked up to the road, looked around, and then returned. Considering that many months had passed since then, this discrepancy in the testimonies did not seem serious. However, the police still decided to make sure that he was telling the truth and offered to undergo a polygraph test. George agreed, but to their surprise, he did not pass it. In a subsequent conversation with detectives, the man admitted that he had hidden one fact from them. He claimed that on the night Karen disappeared, he saw an unknown man near her house. George could only remember that the man was tall and had red hair and a beard. The detectives once again doubted whether he was telling the truth. George could not explain why he had not mentioned this man during the initial interview because the man knew where he lived and could harm his family. Despite this, the police tried to follow up on this lead and find the man, but the result was zero. Another nuance was that there was almost 30 meters between George and Karen's houses, and it was pitch dark outside. The detectives doubted that the man could see the color of another person's hair under such conditions, but George insisted on his story. Recreated the events of that night and asked George to describe the man who stood 30 meters away from him. He could not see any details, which made the detectives even more suspicious of his words. Nevertheless, they walked around the area and asked local residents, "Have you noticed a suspicious man with red hair who could walk on their streets at night?" To their surprise, several women admitted that they had occasionally seen a man who looking into their windows in the dark. None of them saw the face of this man, but one woman managed to notice him and, according to her, he looked very much like George Lewis. She was not 100% sure because it was dark outside and the man immediately ran away. George admitted that he did sometimes look into his neighbors' windows, but he insisted that he did it solely for their safety. He said he was just trying to make sure everything was okay with them since he was responsible for the security of his neighborhood as the head of the neighborhood watch. But all this only strengthened the suspicion against him. In March 1985, George agreed to a second polygraph test. This time he changed his story again. He admitted that not only did he see a man in front of Karen's house, but he also approached him to talk, and the man threatened to kill him if he told anyone about him. The polygraph operator once again detected a lie, so the investigator asked George directly, "Did he kill Karen Gregory?" The man answered negatively, and once again his words were considered false. Afterwards, the detectives decided to talk to George's wife, who told them that she had woken up that night from a piercing scream and was very frightened. She had tried to find her husband and went to the garage, but he was not there and the light in the garage was turned off. The woman then returned home and sat in the kitchen waiting for her husband, who only returned half an hour later. The detectives also decided to delve into George's biography and spoke with his ex-wife, who admitted that the man only seemed kind, caring, and responsible. In reality, he was very aggressive and raised his hand to her during frequent arguments. She added that he even choked her sometimes. Afterwards, the investigator spoke with George's close friends, who also shared some interesting information. Several months before the murder, when Karen was not yet living with him but periodically visited him, George told his friends that he liked her. Moreover, the detectives learned that the man sometimes participated in orgies and mentioned that he wanted Karen to join them. During these conversations with George's friends, the police also learned that in the summer of 1984, the man had a secret affair with a young woman who lived a few houses away from him. They spoke with her and learned something else. The young woman admitted that on her 17th birthday, George gave her a white lace corset. It was too big for her, but the man still made her wear it regularly. The police asked her to give them the corset and immediately showed it to Karen's boyfriend. He said that an identical corset had gone missing from the house and that its size matched Karen's. It was the first serious evidence against George. But the detectives continued to dig further. They took a footprint from him and sent it to FBI experts to compare it to the footprint found on the bathroom floor in Karen's house. After some time, the results came in. A complete match. In March 1986, George was called back to the police station and the detectives asked several times, was he in Karen's house on the night of the murder? The man denied it until the detective told him about the result of the examination. For the next few minutes, George continued to deny everything. But then he gave the police a new story. This time he said that he saw a red-haired man near Karen's house, then ran to her house and saw that everything around was bloody and the woman was lying in the hallway with a cut on her throat. Afterwards, he panicked and ran away from there, deciding never to remember that horror again. Of course, detectives didn't believe his story for a second because it sounded completely unbelievable. But George was right about one thing. There was indeed a cut on the victim's throat which hadn't been disclosed publicly. Even if his story was true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut due to the large amount of blood on Karen's body. At least experienced medical experts couldn't see it until the blood was washed away. This meant that George could only know about the cut if he was the killer. All of the above was enough to finally arrest the man. He was taken into custody on March 15th, almost 2 years after the murder in the state of Florida. He could have faced the death penalty for what he did. George's close friends and colleagues in the fire department didn't share the police's certainty that he was the killer. They still considered him a good person and made every effort to help him. These people gave part of their salary to George's wife and child and even raised $300,000 for bail. Several of his colleagues even mortgaged their homes. As a result, George was released in late December. He lived in his house for another 6 months, and the trial didn't begin until June 4, 1987. George's lawyers insisted that the man hadn't killed anyone and never changed his version of events in conversations with the police. However, when the suspect was given the floor, he came up with a completely new story. Its beginning was the same. He saw a man near Karen's residence, ran into the house and saw her body. This sight made George very sick and he ran to the bathroom where he vomited. Apparently, this was how he tried to explain the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. But there was one obvious nuance here. If he had originally run into Karen's house barefoot, the bloody traces would have been from where he found her body to the bathroom. But they weren't there. When asked why he didn't call the police, George said that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too scared to tell anyone about it. It's worth noting that the man had been a firefighter since he was 18 and regularly dealt with horrific situations at work. But when he saw his dead neighbor, he suddenly couldn't even call the police. The prosecution insisted that George had feelings for Karen. For several months, he waited until her boyfriend left for a week and decided to take advantage of the situation. George broke into her house and attacked her. Although the woman managed to scream and even resist him, in the end he killed her and subjected her to violence. As for the footprint of his foot on the bathroom floor, there could be a simple explanation. Apparently, he tried to wash his clothes stained with Karen's blood in the bathroom and took off his shoes with socks, which also got blood on them. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. A month later, when his sentence was due to be announced, the judge suddenly scheduled a retrial. George's lawyers pushed for this, and they succeeded. They insisted that some evidence had been compromised by the police and the prosecution had not been able to fully prove their client's guilt. The judge's decision came as a shock to all participants in the process, as it rarely happens. However, the prosecutor was able to challenge this decision, and in 1989, it was overturned. In the end, George was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was ruled out because the man had no criminal history prior to the murder. Since then, George has tried to challenge his sentence several times but has been denied each time. Many of his friends and relatives continue to believe that he was innocent despite all the facts and evidence against him. George died in prison in 2014 at the age of 52. He insisted on his innocence until the very end and even gave an interview in which he talked about how difficult it was to bear the punishment for a crime he did not commit. In this whole story, one important point should be noted. 16 neighbors heard Karen scream, but none of them dared to call the police. Given that the police station was located near their street, the patrol could have arrived at the scene in a matter of minutes. The detectives who worked on this case admitted that in such a case, Karen's life could have been saved. But it did not happen. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoyed it. A woman in Australia left her home and disappeared without a trace, leaving her husband and 2 children behind. Relatives tried to contact her, but after several weeks of unsuccessful attempts, they decided to turn to the police. An investigation was conducted and it was concluded that the woman was not in danger and had the right to control her own fate. Since then, she has not contacted her family, and only 40 years later that they learned the shocking truth. Lynette Joy Dawson was born on May 5, 1948 in the Australian state of New South Wales. She grew up in a large, loving family with 2 brothers and a sister. Together with her parents, they lived in the small town of Clovelly, which is essentially a suburb of Sydney. Lynette was a cheerful child, had many friends, and always tried to help her loved ones. Her parents decided to send her to Sydney Girls High School, believing it would be the best choice for her. The school often held events in conjunction with Sydney Boys High School. And in 1965, at one of these events, Lynette met a boy named Chris Dawson. They were both 16 years old, and soon the couple began dating. After finishing school, Lynette decided to pursue a career in medicine. She wanted to help people, so she chose to become a nurse. At the same time, she took a part-time job at a childcare center. When Chris and Lynette were 21, they decided to get married. The couple got married in 1970. The newlyweds moved to the northern suburb of Sydney called Bayview, where the woman got a job at a local hospital. Chris was actively involved in sports and played professional rugby since 1972. He had a twin brother named Paul, with whom they were in the same sports team. Later, they both decided to end their professional careers and became physical education coaches at one of the Sydney schools. Chris and Lynette dreamed of a large family, but they struggled to conceive for a long time. After 6 years of unsuccessful attempts, they began to consider adopting a child from an orphanage, but Lynette finally became pregnant. The couple had their first daughter, followed by their second. Lynette and Chris were happy to finally have children. Their family seemed exemplary to friends and acquaintances, but soon the first signs of trouble began to appear in this idyllic picture. Lynette's friends started to notice bruises and injuries on her body periodically. When asked about it, Lynette claimed that it was nothing serious and her friends shouldn't worry about it. Lynette's friends were concerned for her, but they didn't see what was happening as something truly terrible. In those days, domestic violence wasn't considered a serious crime in the eyes of a significant portion of society in Australia. Moreover, everyone who knew Chris considered him a loving husband and caring father who never showed signs of aggression and was a positive person, and hoped that the couple would solve their problems. But the relationship between Lynette and Chris only continued to deteriorate. Lynette noticed that her husband had cooled towards her and was worried about the future of their family. A few years after the birth of their daughters, they decided to use the services of a nanny. Chris suggested this job to one of his 15-year-old school students, Bev McNally. But she didn't stay in this part-time job for long. She witnessed Chris raising his hand to Lynette twice and decided to leave. After this, Chris offered this job to another of his 16-year-old students, Joanne Curtis. After some time, Joanne had problems in her family and Chris offered her to stay with them for some time so she could spend more time looking after the children until the situation in her family improved. Despite her kindness and desire to help people, Lynette was against this. She was deeply concerned about the problems in their own family and didn't want someone else to be constantly present in their home. However, Chris insisted on it, and in October 1981, Joanne moved in with them. The young woman lived with them for about a month until Lynette discovered that her husband was sleeping with Joanne. It was a real shock for her and another blow to their marriage. She kicked Joanne out of the house but decided not to divorce Chris. Lynette wanted to keep their family together for the sake of their children, and she continued to love her husband despite his actions. Just a few months later, on December 3, 1981, Lynette faced yet another shock. Chris left her a note saying that he was leaving the family. He wrote that he would move to another city with Joanne and asked his wife not to portray him in a bad light to the children. Lynette was devastated by this news, but a few days later she was surprised again. Chris returned home because Joanne changed her mind about avoiding him in another city and asked to be taken back. Meanwhile, Chris spent New Year's Eve with Joanne, leaving his wife alone with the children. At that time, Joanne moved into Chris's brother's house, which was on the same street. Despite everything that was happening, Lynette wanted to keep their family together no matter what, so she decided to enroll in family therapy. Chris was against this idea, but she managed to convince him. She went to see the specialist right after New Year's, and it seemed that the therapy had a positive effect on their relationship. Chris started to spend more time with his wife and showed a desire to fix everything. On January 8, 1982, Lynette called her mother and told her that the family therapy was going well. They also agreed to meet with her and other relatives at the local beach the next day, and her mother thought that her daughter's speech sounded a bit unclear, as if Lynette was drunk. The woman explained that Chris had prepared some alcoholic drink for her. The next day, the relatives were waiting for Lynette on the beach, but she never showed up. They called her at home, and Chris said that he had driven his wife to the bus stop that morning. She was going to the store to return some clothes that didn't fit. However, she never returned home, and her relatives began to worry. In the evening, Chris called Lynette's mother and told her that his wife had contacted him by phone. She said that because of the problems in their marriage, she had decided to be away from home for a while and gather her thoughts. Her relatives thought that what was happening was strange, as they were aware of the problems that had been building up between the spouses for years, but they still couldn't imagine Lynette leaving her 2 daughters. She loved her children more than anything in the world and never mentioned considering the possibility of going somewhere. Days passed, but Lynette still didn't contact her family, which only added to their worry. On January 12th, Chris reported that Lynette had called their home phone and said that she was okay. Since then, he had spoken to her a few more times and told her relatives that she had been using her bank card. Despite this, her family continued to doubt that Lynette was okay. She didn't know how to drive and didn't take any items that she might need for living. She even left behind cash that was hidden in case of an emergency. 3 weeks later, Lynette's eldest daughter started 1st grade as the school year in Australia begins in January. But Lynette missed this event, which caused even more concern for her relatives. They were practically certain that something bad had happened to her. While Chris said that she continued to regularly call home, and the last such call was at the end of January. Since then, Lynette hadn't been in contact. On February 18th, 6 weeks after Lynette left home, her husband went to the police. He filed a missing person report and expressed suspicion that amid all the problems in their marriage, Lynette could have joined some religious organization or even a cult. Her relatives denied such a possibility, as Lynette was not religious and didn't attend church. The police began a search, but they had absolutely no leads. Lynette's mother and other members of her family were certain that she would never leave home, abandoning her daughters, so they believed that she had been kidnapped where some other tragedy had occurred. Despite this, the police concluded that Lynette had indeed left home, as they had no evidence of the contrary. They tried to find her for some time and then stopped the investigation. Chris posted a message for Lynette in a local newspaper calling for her to come home. He wrote that he loved her and was eagerly awaiting her call. He also called all of her friends, trying to find any information about his wife's whereabouts. Despite Chris's eagerness to find Lynette, he divorced her a year after her disappearance, and the next year he married Joanne Curtis, his former student and lover, who had moved in with him on January 10, 1982, a day after Lynette went missing. Joanne became the stepmother of Lynette's daughters, and Chris, not wanting to traumatize the children with the stories of their mother's disappearance, told them that Joanne was their real mother. Lynette's relatives were not happy about what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. They stopped relying. Police, as they had long ago stopped investigating due to the complete lack of leads. Moreover, they didn't even try to question all of her relatives and friends, and the case was abandoned almost immediately without a proper investigation. Chris and Joanne moved to Queensland with the children, selling their old house. Chris almost completely cut ties with his former wife's relatives, only occasionally calling her mother. Later, Chris and Joanne had a daughter. 6 years passed, and during that time, Lynette never contacted anyone. This continued until 1990, when something unexpected happened. Chris and Joanne divorced, and soon after that, Joanne contacted Lynette's relatives to pass on shocking information. She said that she had suspected her husband of murdering his ex-wife all this time. According to her, a month before Lynette's disappearance, Chris had talked about hiring a hitman to get rid of her. On the very day she disappeared, he told Joanne that Lynette had left forever and would never return. She also advised the police to search the backyard of the house where Lynette and Chris lived. In 1991, the police questioned Chris. He said that his ex-wife was just trying to tarnish his name and that he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance. He admitted that the woman was intentionally doing this to get custody of their daughter after the divorce. At that time, the court was deciding who would have custody of their child, and Chris' arrest would have been beneficial to Joanne. Police seized phones from Chris and his brother, but nothing suspicious was found. So investigators once again abandoned the case, considering Joanne's words dubious. The case remained dormant for another 9 years until 2000, when police decided to excavate the backyard of Chris's old home. But there was a catch. Due to insufficient funding, they only dug around the pool area. This area was chosen after police talked to the new homeowners. According to them, during the sale, Chris persistently asked if they planned to change anything exactly in this place. The only thing that the police managed to find was a torn pink cardigan. Investigators admitted that it could have belonged to Lynette and contained some evidence, but DNA analysis found no matches with Lynette. A year later, the case was once again brought to attention. That Lynette was killed by someone she knew. Police resumed the investigation, questioning her friends and relatives, but they failed to find any leads. Only in 2003, 2 years later, investigators publicly announced that they considered Chris a suspect. They wanted to charge him with murder, but it never happened. Due to the complete lack of evidence, the man could not be convicted. But investigators managed to find many witnesses who reported that Chris and his brother regularly had intimate relationships with their school students. However, no charges were brought on this matter, and as a result, the case stalled again. In 2006, Chris claimed that he saw his wife among the extras of a series filmed in England, but no one could find any evidence to support his words. In 2010, police announced a $100,000 reward for information about Lynette's disappearance. And 4 years later, they doubled the amount. Despite the large number of appeals, this did not bring any results, and they failed to find any reliable leads. In cases where a monetary reward is promised, there are always many people who want to earn some extra money. They are ready to make up any information, just to get the money. In 2015, police dug up a section of Chris's former home, trying to find his wife's body, but they were unsuccessful. The turning point in this case came in 2018 when a podcast about Lynette's disappearance was released and gained massive popularity in Australia. Arguments were presented in favor of Lynette's husband being responsible for her murder. The podcast was listened to by several million people, which led to a wave of public outrage. Australians accused the police of negligence and demanded that the culprit be punished. The podcast's author, Hadley Thomas, spoke to Lynette's relatives and tried to find new leads. Although he was unable to find any new evidence against Chris, the public outcry was enough to initiate a new investigation. As a result, on December 5th of that year, detectives arrested Chris for the first time on charges of murder. He continued to insist on his innocence and was released on bail before the start of the trial. The wait dragged on for several years. In 2019, he appeared before a judge and claimed that he did not kill his wife and that the trial should have started in 2020. But Chris's lawyers consistently delayed the process. They insisted that due to the widespread coverage of the case in the media, their client had a biased attitude towards him. So they demanded that they abandon the jury and conduct a trial where the judge would make the decision. In May 2022, this demand was approved and the trial finally began. Chris's lawyers insisted that there was not a single piece of evidence against their clients and all the charges were based on societal bias due to the podcast. According to them, the author presented his opinion in such a way that many believed in Chris's guilt and refused to adequately evaluate the situation. Despite the lack of direct evidence on the prosecution's side, they built their case on a multitude of indirect factors. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette, who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body, testified in court. And Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors who witnessed the man beating her also testified in court. They recounted that the day before Lynette's disappearance, when she returned to family therapy, she had bruises on her neck. One of the key witnesses was Joanne, who revealed that as she grew older, she realized how unhealthy her relationship with Chris was. He became obsessed with her. She was only 15 years old. He would leave notes in her backpack at school and ask her out on dates. He was persistent and didn't take no for an answer, so the young woman felt like she had nowhere to turn. According to Joanne, Chris completely controlled her life. He told her what to wear, who to talk to, and what to do. He monitored her every move and couldn't stand it when things. As a result, the woman concluded that the man could have easily killed his wife. According to the prosecution, Chris had wanted to end the marriage for a long time, but he would have lost part of his property and custody of the children in the divorce, so he decided to kill Lynette and stage her disappearance. In addition, he wanted to get rid of her so that she wouldn't interfere with his relationship with Joanne. Chris' lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that Joanne had made all of this up to intentionally slander her ex-husband. They also called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette years after her disappearance. These testimonies became the mainstay of the defense, but there was no evidence to support their claims. The prosecution believed that these testimonies were simply fabricated and that if Lynette was alive, she would have contacted her relatives and daughters over the years. As for the phone calls that Chris allegedly received in the first month of her disappearance, no evidence of their existence could be found. The prosecution argued that the woman was already dead at that time and the man made it all up to convince Lynette's relatives that she was okay. In their view, Chris killed the woman on January 9th, drove her body in an unknown direction, and hid it. Because the police were negligent in their work in those years, no proper investigation was conducted. Although the killer's motives were always obvious. The trial lasted for 10 weeks, and on August 30, 2022, the judge found Chris guilty. A few months later, in early December, the sentence was announced: 24 years in prison, with the possibility of applying for early release after 18 years of considering that he will be 92 years old by then. Chris may simply not live to see the time. After the sentence was handed down, Lynette's relatives, including her eldest daughter, spoke. She no longer doubted that her father had killed her mother and said that his actions had destroyed her life. The woman demanded that her father confess where he had hidden Lynette's body so that the family could finally bury her. But Chris remained silent and looked at the floor while his daughter spoke. Despite the fact that almost 41 years have passed since Lynette's murder, her relatives still hope to find her remains. Chris, who is now 74 years old, continues to insist on his innocence, but even his own children do not believe him. Thus, one of Australia's most high-profile cases was solved in large part thanks to a podcast that drew the attention of millions of people to this unjust story. If the police had conducted a proper investigation from the beginning, the killer could have been punished immediately after the crime, not after 4 decades. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video. A young mother was found dead in her bedroom. From the very beginning of the investigation, detectives faced almost complete lack of evidence. However, soon the case took a very unexpected turn. As a result, they learned shocking details that changed the course of the case and allowed them to uncover the truth. Michelle Young was born on February 17, 1977 in the small American town of Sayville, New York. From an early age, the girl was characterized by perseverance and determination. She set ambitious goals for herself and made every effort to achieve them. In school, she excelled academically and was captain of the cheerleading team. She also chose a career path quite early in life. To obtain the necessary education, Michelle enrolled at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She also joined the local cheerleading team, but later decided to leave it and fully focus on her studies. For years later, she earned a master's degree, and almost immediately after that, she got a job at a local accounting company. Her position provided a decent income right from the start. She rented an apartment in a good area and devoted a large part of her time to climbing the career ladder. In February 2001, while celebrating her 24th birthday with friends, Michelle met a man named Jason. He was several years older and had graduated from the same university as her. The couple quickly found common ground and soon they started dating. Jason worked as a sales agent in a large company that produced power tools. He lived in another city, and at the time of their meeting, he was in Raleigh on business. After meeting Michelle, he started visiting there more often, and at other times they communicated by phone. Later, he permanently moved to the city, and after some time, he and Michelle started living together. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant. The couple decided to get married. On March 29, 2004, their daughter Cassidy was born, and the family moved into a large house located in a prestigious area on the outskirts of the city. Around the same time, Michelle's sister, Meredith, moved to Raleigh and regularly helped the family take care of the child. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant again, and she and her husband decided they lived in a city called Brevard, which was 400 kilometers away from their home. Unfortunately, instead of a celebration, the trip turned into a tragedy. On the very day the couple planned to return to Raleigh, Jason and Michelle were involved in a serious accident that caused her pregnancy to be terminated. The family was devastated by the news, but just 2 months later, Michelle became pregnant again. After a while, the couple found out that they were having a boy, and they eagerly awaited his birth. On November 2, 2006, Jason left for another city for work. As a sales agent, he regularly traveled around the country for business meetings and negotiations. This time he was headed to a town called Clintwood, which was about 490 kilometers away. That day, Michelle invited her friend, Shelley, to visit. The women talked until evening, after which the friend went home. The next morning, Jason called his wife's sister, Meredith, and told her that before leaving for another city, he found some designer women's bags on an online store with a good discount and wanted to order one for Michelle as a gift for their 3rd anniversary. After his departure, he remembered that he had printed out several pages with these bags and left them on the table in his home office, and learn about the upcoming gift. So he asked her sister to go to their house and take them. Meredith agreed and came to their house at around 1 p.m. At that moment, she did not have the keys with her, and Michelle was supposed to be at work. But the woman knew that the door to their garage was broken and could be easily lifted by hand. She did just that, but immediately noticed something strange. Her sister's car was parked inside. Thinking that she had gone to work, Meredith walked into the house. Upon entering the kitchen, she saw Michelle's purse lying on the floor. The woman called her sister by name, but there was no answer. Instead, she heard their dog barking, which was also strange. When Jason and Michelle left the house, they always let the dog out into the backyard. The woman noticed something red on the floor in the bedroom. Approaching closer, she realized with horror that it was a bloodstain, and next to it was her sister Michelle. She was lying face down. Meredith approached her sister and tried to turn her over, but immediately felt that her sister's body was cold. The woman panicked and immediately called 911. At the same time, Cassidy, the 2-year-old girl who was hiding under the bed next to where the body lay, crawled out and ran to her aunt when she saw her. Meredith called the police and led her outside where they waited for the officers. When the woman was speaking to the operator, he asked, "Is the child okay?" Meredith examined her and found no visible injuries. The only thing she noticed was small blood stains all over the room, which she immediately realized were the child's footprints. The child was immediately handed over to the doctors for examination, and the police began to investigate the crime scene. They immediately noticed something strange. There were bloody footprints of a child all over the room. However, Kennedy's feet were completely clean. Additionally, there wasn't a single drop of blood on the girl. The footprints led to the bathroom in only one direction. Blood stains were found on the inside of the bathroom door, apparently left by the child's hand. Based on all of this, detectives constructed the most obvious version of what had happened. After the murder, the girl was locked in the bathroom for a while, and then someone came in and washed Cassidy clean of blood. Later, when the police talked to Michelle's friend, they learned another interesting fact. Shelley said that they put the girl to sleep together the night before and she was wearing a diaper. However, when the victim's sister came to her house, the child was not wearing a diaper. Based on this, the investigators concluded that the same person who washed the blood off the child also removed the diaper. The detectives did not find any signs of a break-in in the house. They discovered that Michelle's 2 rings, wedding and engagement, were missing from her hand, but all other valuables were in their place, including cash, ruling out the scenario of robbery. Were found on her body and near her, and 4 DNA samples were found on the jewelry box that did not belong to Michelle or her husband. Several fingerprints were also found in the house that did not belong to anyone in their family. In the bedroom where the victim's body was found, experts discovered 2 shoe prints of American size 10 and 12 with the pattern on the soles. They were even able to determine the model of the shoes. Additionally, detectives noticed blood splatters on the door of the closet with clothing. However, the door was open and the splatters were arranged in a way that suggested the door should have been closed when they landed. On Jason's home office computer, the police found something interesting in the browsing history. Besides pages from a women's handbag store and a search for directions to Clintwood, there were several alarming search queries such as anatomy of a knockout, loss of consciousness from head trauma, and related topics. Medical experts concluded that Michelle died from a head injury inflicted by a heavy object. The perpetrator struck her over 30 times. And at the time of her death, she was 5 months pregnant and her baby did not survive the attack. The exact time of Michelle's death was not determined, but experts speculated that it most likely occurred at 5 or 6 in the morning. The brutality of the crime suggested that the perpetrator may have known the victim and harbored a strong dislike towards her. As usual, the detectives first looked into Michelle's husband. They spoke with her friends and relatives who provided them with a lot of interesting information. Their marriage was quite problematic as Jason and Michelle often argued over domestic issues. Furthermore, Jason was not happy when his wife became pregnant with their first child. He asked her to terminate the pregnancy, but Michelle refused. When Michelle became pregnant again after an accident they were involved in, Jason was once again not pleased with the news. It seemed like the couple might divorce in the foreseeable future. Meredith also told the police that Jason's request to retrieve the handbag printouts initially seemed strange to her, considering the obvious problems in their marriage, and it had already been over 3 weeks since their anniversary. However, one obvious fact contradicted the theories of Jason's involvement. At the time of the murder, he was in another city that was 490 kilometers away. And called the police. She also informed their relatives about what had happened. Michelle's mother called Jason's parents while he was on his way from Clintwood to visit them. He decided to stop by his parents' house before heading home, and upon arrival, they told him about what had happened. Jason was shocked by the news and immediately left for Raleigh with other relatives. During this trip, a friend called Jason and told him that the police were asking a lot of questions about him. Jason made a strange decision and said he didn't want to talk to the police and wanted to hire a lawyer, which only increased the investigators' suspicions but also gave them a new lead. Shelley, who was visiting the victim the day before the murder, told the police something interesting. Michelle had told her that she had been feeling like someone was constantly watching her lately. Shelley herself also felt like someone was watching them through the window that evening and even asked her friend to walk her to her car because she was a little scared to leave the house alone. Detectives tried to find any evidence related to possible surveillance but continued to investigate Jason's potential involvement. Jason left his house in his car on November 2nd in the afternoon and, considering it was about a 6-hour drive to Clintwood, decided to stop and stay at the Hampton Hotel, which is roughly halfway on the route. Detectives requested surveillance footage from this hotel and actually saw Jason check in at 10:54 p.m. and 2 minutes later he used his key card to enter his room and the card was not used again after that. The next morning around 7:40 a.m. he called his mother and the signal passed through a cell tower located near the town of Whiteville. This town was on the way from the hotel to Clintwood where his business meeting was supposed to take place.